Welcome to another episode of Tech Captains. I'm Ron Danenberg, joined as always by my co-host Gareth Thomas. Today we have the privilege of speaking with a true leader in the tech industry, Meri Williams. Meri is currently the Chief Technology Officer at Pleo, where she leads the charge in revolutionizing how companies manage expenses with smart company cards and automated expense reports. With a wealth of experience spanning multiple industries, Meri's impressive career includes roles as a technology advisor, as a VC, a non-executive director at Flagstone, and a driving force behind the Lead Developer Conference as its chair. She's also made significant impacts at companies like Monzo, and that's how I first heard about you, Meri. Meri is not just a technologist, but a leader who has consistently transformed teams and organizations, helping them scale and thrive in ever-changing landscapes. So we're thrilled to have you today on the show, Meri. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a very kind intro. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. So like I just said, like you've held numerous leadership roles across different companies. I met you for the first time at an in-person conference at Monzo. I interviewed you when I think you were at a company called Helix, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
And so you've been from startup to large organizations. What, in your view, are the key differences in leading technology teams at these different scales,
I
if
think
any?
I think there are a lot of differences. So I grew up at Procter Gamble, which was obviously a huge company. I was there for 10 years at the beginning of my career, and everything was very, very organized, and all the processes and procedures all existed and all that kind of stuff. And so I think the biggest change going from that kind of environment to startup environment was just the level of ambiguity, how much was unclear, how much there wasn't a process, wasn't a procedure, wasn't a principle even for how to deal with things, and dealing with that level of ambiguity and fuzziness was the major change that I experienced going from one to the other. I think that there's a lot of advantage to that, though, in startups and scale-ups, that there's a lot of opportunity to find things and to make them better. And often going from nothing to something is both quite easy and very impactful. Whereas when I was growing up at P&G, it was very kind of incremental improvements that you were looking for. You were looking for the tiny bit of extra efficiency in an already very well documented and well thought through process. And so that's definitely been one of the big differences.
I see. And as the current CTO at Pleo, what are some of the biggest challenges you face and how do you address them?
So I think when I joined, the biggest challenge we had was that the product and tech organization was perceived as not delivering very effectively. So a lot, it was felt that our competitors were maybe delivering features faster, moving ahead or pulling ahead compared to us. And so I took over as CTO, and at the same time, a new chief product officer came along. And so we really did a sort of diagnostic exercise. We went and met with every single team and said, what are you proud of? What's holding you back? And if we had a magic wand, what should we use it on? And that gave us a really good, deep insight into what was wrong in the organization, what was annoying people, frustrating people. And then we just went about trying to address that. So we got much clearer roadmaps, we got much clearer prioritization, but we also started to do a load of investing in golden paths, sensible defaults, just helping it be less mental overhead for people to figure out how to deliver great features and deliver a great product to the customer, because everybody really wanted to do the right thing for our customers, but there was a lot of stuff in their way. And so we just sort of very rigorously went about trying to break down all of those barriers and try to make things better. And we've seen in the last 18 months the throughput of the teams has gone up by almost 200%. So
Wow.
they're really, really, really delivering hugely better than they were prior to that point in time.
And how do you measure that throughput?
So we use Swarmia for the DORA metrics, and so it's a rough metric. It's sort of a number of PRs, but it's it's a metric I like, because even if people try to game the system by doing smaller PRs are a kind of a better idea anyway. More atomic changes tend to be less dangerous, and so it's one of the measures I really like, because even if people do catch on that you're paying attention to it and they start to try and kind of game the system, it has positive side effects even if they do that, and so I think that's pretty good. Same with cycle time. Even if people try to game cycle time, I think shorter iterations and more atomic changes tend to be a better outcome anyway.
And so you've just mentioned some of the challenges at Pleo, and that you've worked at both all type of size of companies. And so, what advice would you give other technology leaders who are navigating rapid growth in their companies?
I mean, I think we're lucky these days if we're navigating rapid growth. It's changed a lot in recent times, hasn't it? I think a lot of people assume that the hardest thing about growing rapidly is going to be recruitment, and obviously recruitment is tough, and staffing up the teams that you want to staff is always challenging, and you want to build a great employer brand and attract the right people and retain the right people. But I think that actually getting those people in and helping them to be independently productive is much more challenging. So great onboarding, great documentation, making it really possible for somebody to join and be independently productive within a few weeks is where the real secret lies. And that requires strong prioritization, really good communication, and really good investment in things like onboarding and knowledge management, and just making it so that not every person is starting from nothing and having to figure everything out for themselves. Like, help them know what the normal ways of doing things are, help them know what those golden paths look like, what those sensible defaults are. And those are, I talk a lot about sensible defaults rather than standards, because I think people can find standards to be quite stifling. It makes you feel like you've got limited choices, you have to do things a certain way. Whereas I think the framing around golden paths and sensible defaults is much better. It says you get a bunch of stuff for free if you could do it this way. You can, of course, do it a different way if you need to. If you've got a special need, or something is unique about the problem that you're addressing or the way that you need to address it, you're, of course, free to go and do what you need to. But if you follow this way of doing things, then all of the tooling, all of the observability comes for free, testing frameworks are there, all of these other things. And I think that's powerful, and people find it much less stifling or restrictive than it might be if you sort of stick to there just being one set of standards.
And so maybe can you give us a bit of an overview of your architecture there, Pleo?
Sure. So we're on, from an infrastructure point of view, we're primarily on AWS. We use GCP, but just for our data estate. Just because data folks tend to like to build on top of BigQuery, and I don't blame them. It's a nicer environment for them. I'd say we have a service-oriented architecture rather than a microservices oriented architecture, just because some of our services are a little bit bigger than I'd like them to be, and that's some sort of historical just reality that we're dealing with. It used to be a Node.js shop, and then has transitioned over to being Kotlin. So we've got a load of Kotlin services and microservices. React on the front end, with React Native for our mobile app, and it's fairly simple, to be honest. It's not rocket surgery, expense management. It's just all of the devil's in the details. It's all the specific legal requirements for how per diem works here or mileage works there, and that kind of stuff tends to be what adds complexity.
It's interesting because I'm kind of a fan of it's never ended up that way where I've been, although I've sort of sometimes tried to push things in that direction, but I'm kind of a fan of just JavaScript throughout and a very homogeneous development languages, which it sounds like you've done. But so it's interesting asking about the architecture, because I saw an interview you did. You've done lots of interviews, some really great stuff I've heard you talk about. So you said in an interview, and I think this was relating to Pleo, you said it's super useful in the early days of a product to build it as a monolith. So we've had quite a few discussions on this podcast around that, but I don't think anyone has stated that so bluntly, and it's true, right? So the really important lesson we always hear about architecture is that your choices are unique. Every company's different or requirements. So for Pleo, why did, I mean, and I'm guessing you probably weren't there though when this decision was made, but why do you think the monolith made sense for Pleo at the time that it did?
So I think they had a really small engineering team for a really long time. So
Right.
when
Okay. Yeah.
at the beginning of 2022, they got a major investment and then added 700 people in 7 months to the company, which was intense
That's some
hyperscaling.
growth. Yeah. Yeah. That's
Yeah,
crazy.
that was some real growth, and
Right.
so went from under 50 engineers to over 200 in that 7 months. And I think when you've got a relatively small set of engineers, you can have a single mobile team that looks after the mobile app. You can have a relatively small number of engineers collaborating on the back end, and then a relatively small number of engineers collaborating on the front end as well. And I think in that situation, where you've got a small team who are deeply immersed in the detail, who are able to hold the entire app in their head, I think a monolith makes perfect sense. And when you're trying to find product market fit and make sure that the customer actually wants what you're building, you can waste time trying to build the perfect architecture that will scale forever, that isn't actually necessary, because the chances that you're going to wake up one morning and be Google scale or Facebook scale or Amazon scale are very small, right? Some of us are that lucky, but very few companies are lucky to have an overnight success like that. What's usually much more important is to find that product market fit, to be able to evolve really rapidly. And so I think in the early days of Pleo, when there was this very tight knit group of engineers, they all could hold everything in their heads. They could keep track of all the features and all the ways that everything fit together. It worked perfectly well. Monzo is really the only place I've been that went microservices and service oriented from right from the beginning. And that was because they knew that they were going to start off building and have to build for a couple of years before they would get to be a bank, because it takes so long to become a bank
Yeah.
in the UK.
Yeah.
You've got to go through this whole application process, and then they found some amazing ways around that at Monzo. In the early days, they figured out that the prepaid cards would be a way for them to explore and build an MVP and figure out what customers really wanted and valued. And then they did a transition over to the banking infrastructure and to having their own MasterCard processor and things like that. I think that Monzo was one of the rare examples where it made a lot of sense to do that kind of fully fledged scalable architecture approach from the early days, because they had such high ambition and they had found this way of experimenting that taught them a lot about what customers really wanted.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think sometimes that's the trap that less experienced CTOs fall into, is the obsession over, oh, will it scale, as opposed to you need to get features out there, because without features, you probably don't have a business.
Yeah.
So on that interview, you then went on to say, you pointed out the challenges of growth and the separation of concerns and sort of deconstructing that. Can you maybe just talk a little bit about that process and how you did that?
Yeah, so at Pleo we've got there's a historical decision that all services were named after moons, like in the sky moons. So
Okay.
they call them moons rather than services.
All
And
right.
there's a moon called Deimos, which is the monolith. And we have had a program for the last 18 months called Death to Deimos, which is literally to kill the monolith. And so we've been essentially looking at it from a business logic point of view, from a logical standpoint, and carving out pieces into separate services over time. And then, you start off around the edges. There are things that were added into the monolith that are very easy to pull away and disentangle, and then you get into the real spaghetti in the middle, where it's all intertwined and it's all really, really difficult to get through. And that's the stage that we're at the moment, where we're really taking the core entities out of Deimos, and putting them into other services and pulling them out. So at the moment, one of the key trackers that I look at on a regular basis is how is the traffic to our monolith reducing over time,
Mm.
and where are the big drop-offs. And when I joined the company, we were in a situation where there were Deimos related incidents that were fairly major, like platform unavailable level incidents on a fairly regular basis, every couple of weeks. And we're in a position now where I think it's been months since we last had a monolith related major incident, because we've really managed to pull away a lot of the pieces and remove the contention on the database. Not everything is all in one single store anymore. We've got it separated out into services with their own data stores, and we're able to manage that much better. It's still some work to do before we'll get to being completely free of it. Somebody drew a very cute logo that's everybody's going to get a sticker at the point that the thing finally dies. But yeah, we've been just chipping it away at it. And I think one of the risks that everybody runs when they move away from a monolithic system or from an old architecture to a new architecture is it's really tempting to say, hey, just give me 6 months, just give me a year, just let me have a bunch of time where I don't have to ship any features, where I don't have to work on the product, and just let me do this transformation. Just let me sit in the corner and make this better. And the risk is that it always takes longer than you think it's going to. And any length of time where you don't ship incremental value to customers sucks.
Yeah.
And so we've taken the approach all the way through of going, we're not going to stop delivering value to customers. We're not going to stop shipping new features. We're not going to stop iterating and improving on the product, but we're going to, every time we touch anything in the product, we're going to make everything around that area better. So kind of Boy Scout rule of leaving it better than you found it, and taking the extra time in each of those bits of feature development, in each of those bits of product development, to also fix the underlying services and pull them out from this monolithic entity that we're having to deal with.
Well, hopefully be deaf to Deimos soon. Ron,
Yes.
back to you.
Yeah, Mary, like you've worked extensively in mentoring, coaching in the tech space. I mean, giving a lot of conferences also. What do you believe are the most critical skills that tech leaders need to develop?
I think it varies depending on where you're at in your career. I think that when you're early on, a lot of it is just about shipping value and understanding what the customer needs and how to build it in a clean way, in a scalable way. And then you hit a point where you make the choice between, do you become a leader from a technical point of view as an IC, or do you become a manager?
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of people think of that as a promotion when they become a manager, and it's much more of a career change than it is a promotion. I think that a lot of the experience we get as engineers and as senior engineers, it doesn't teach you very much about people management. You learn a bit about coaching and mentoring, looking after more junior engineers, but it doesn't teach you about how to do performance management or setting expectations or any of those other things that are pretty essential aspects of people management. And so I think that there's that point in time where you kind of go, am I becoming a leader or am I becoming a manager? And hopefully managers can be leaders too, but you can definitely be a leader without being a manager. And then I think from that point, you become more strategic over time. So I think, I see people become whether they become an eng manager or a staff engineer, they end up needing to just think at a different level of abstraction, and then get much more involved in strategy. And then getting good at strategy requires you to become quite commercial. So I think you have to start really understanding how the business that you're part of works, what makes money, what doesn't. It used to be that you could get all the way to CTO and never have cared about budgets. And I think the change in the environment that we've experienced, I grew up in a very different environment than we've had for the last 10 years anyway, where it was, I was used to having to write business cases to get an extra engineer or two, or, to get investment in a project. And I think we're back to those sort of days now. And so I think a lot of leaders have to become much more commercial than they have been in this sort of zero interest rate period that we've been in for a long time, where there were plentiful resources of all descriptions. You could get more people, you could get more money, you could get more time, you could get more projects. And now we're in a stage where it's a lot more about bang for buck, right? What's the return on investment going to be? How quickly is it going to pay back? Is this investment better than that investment? Because you can't do everything the way that you could for a while.
Yeah.
And so I think that commerciality really matters a lot.
That makes a lot of sense. And when you look back at your journey, you mentioned from Procter and Gamble, like it's probably such a long time ago in your mind. And so when you look back, what has been maybe the most or one of the most challenging decisions you've had to make as a technology leader, and what did you learn from it?
Oh, wow. Um, so a lot of my toughest decisions were actually like quite urgent ones in the middle of
Okay.
incidents. So I think I've had a lifetime of being on call. When I was at Helix, it was the first Christmas I'd ever not been on call in my whole career because people aren't doing AI-driven drug discovery over the Christmas break. Where everywhere else I'd been, there was still operations happening at that time. And so I think some of the hardest decisions were those ones where something's broken and you've got to make a choice and you don't have full information, you don't have everything available, and you've just got to make the best decision you can in the moment. Um, there's some famous incidents at Monzo that one of the things I loved at Monzo was how open the culture was about admitting to mistakes and having blameless postmortems and actually publishing a lot of what went wrong. The number of people who told me that they joined Monzo because of how open Monzo was about things going wrong and how we fixed major incidents and issues. But I think um, the the harder thing from a people perspective has been I'm often brought in where a team needs to level up a lot, and then there's a lot of micro decisions about whether an individual is going to be able to keep up with the increase in expectations, the um, raising of the bar, and whether you're going to be able to support them through that, or whether they're just not got the motivation or the capacity to step up enough.
Yeah.
And those are really tough conversations and really
Yeah.
tough decisions where you're letting somebody go because they just don't have the motivation or the capability to step up with the standard and the bar being raised.
Yeah, but you just mentioned the blameless postmortem at Monzo. Don't you think that it removes a sense of responsibility, that it absolves people from any responsibility when something happens?
So I never experienced that at Monzo. At Monzo, anytime there was an incident, everybody wanted to fix it. Everybody wanted to help, and people felt such a sense of responsibility because this is real people's money, and everybody who was at Monzo banked with Monzo, so it was their own money too.
Yeah,
And so I found that it made it really much better that we were blameless because people would admit to things. They weren't trying to hide a decision they'd
yeah,
made or a mistake that was made. They were much more open to talking about the reality of it. But I think that was because it worked because there was a culture of really, really deeply caring, and then the blameless post-mortem or incident review was all about just finding out what went wrong and how we could do better rather than finding out who did something wrong, because almost every major incident in any kind of once you're at a certain size, it's
yeah,
very unlikely that it's an individual who did something wrong,
yeah,
or even if an individual did something wrong, half the problem is that the system didn't stop them, right?
yeah,
half,
Yeah,
half,
or there was something not documented that should have been documented, right? A lack of training. I mean, you can
yeah.
sometimes go quite far back, can't you? So yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, I mean, at Moo once we had somebody who decided to like live edit DNS records in the middle of the working day while and took down the entire site, and that was a little less blameless. I'll be honest. We had quite a conversation about being more aware of the fact that the site took money all the time, and that this person had lost more than their salary for the year in a 20-minute downtime, and but that was, yes, there were systemic failures in that no individual should have been able to do that, but also it was a fucking stupid thing to do live, right? So I think that there's a certain level of maturity that's needed before that blameless culture can be really, really effective as well.
Yeah, and that's a good point.
yeah. And so, Mary, we have a small tradition in the podcast that the guest presents a book that they really enjoyed. And one of the
Mhm.
books that you send is First Break All the Rules from Gallup.
Yeah.
I suppose it's a Gallup edition or Gallup Press. So it's a group. So I don't know if you can tell us more about it.
Yeah, so I'm a real nerd, and so it's my favorite management book, which I appreciate makes me very nerdy and not cool to have a drink with on a Friday night. But it's my favorite management book because it's so data driven. So they Gallup went and did a huge study investigating not what made teams happy, but what made them highly productive. So they looked at, why is this restaurant better than all the others in the chain? Why is this division of a company more profitable than the other divisions? Why has this factory got such a better safety record? Whatever the definition of success was for all these different kind of companies and industries and similar. It's a little bit America centric is the one criticism I have of it. They interviewed tens of thousands of people and came up with these 12 questions that predict high performance. And I found that really, really helpful because I think I ended up a manager when I shouldn't have done. I was in a company when I was growing up where there wasn't an option except to go into management. There wasn't any kind of IC track. I couldn't have stayed a staff engineer and continued down that road. I think if that had been available to me, I probably would have been better suited to it. And so when I became a manager, I was just terrified of being a terrible manager. I now know I'm autistic and I've got ADHD, and so I've got a few things stacked against me in terms of being naturally good at people related things, which I didn't know at the time, but makes a lot of sense in retrospect. And so I think what I really loved about this book was it just gave a really data-based approach to figuring out how to help people be really high performing at work, but also when people are high performing, they're really happy. And so I view First Break All the Rules as this kind of almost Bible of how to do people management really well. And there's these, like I mentioned, there's sort of 12 questions, which are the core of the book. And it's quite hard to remember 12 individual questions. Yeah. And so I also really like Drive, which talks about purpose, autonomy, and mastery. And those 12 questions they fit very easily into that framework of purpose, autonomy, mastery. And then what's missing is inclusion. And I call that inclusion. Camille Fournier talks about it as community. But essentially, I think if you've got purpose, believing in why, you've got autonomy, so you get a say in what, you've got mastery, you're proud of how, and then you've got inclusion, you feel like you belong, then that adds up to high performing teams. And that's why I love that book so much.
So I had a wait, what moment then. So you're probably one of the most famous, if you can call it fame, people in tech, certainly in the UK, right? And you just said, in case I'm mistaken, that you think you might have been better being a staff engineer going down the IC route than where you are today, even though you've been an incredibly successful CTO. Is that what you said?
Yeah. I am not good at. I am not naturally good at people things. I spend a lot of energy trying to figure out what people are thinking and what their motivations are, and I have to do it all very cerebrally because I'm autistic and I don't have a lot of natural empathy, I suppose, or natural ability to read people's emotions. And so it takes a lot of effort and a lot of energy for me to figure out what people are thinking and where they're coming from. And so, yeah, I think if it had been available to me as a route when I was at that decision point that now exists between becoming an eng manager and becoming a staff engineer, I think I probably would have gone down the staff engineer route and maybe ended up as a principal or something like that. It's been a great career, but it's been a very high effort career because of those fundamental differences.
Right, but I mean, there's the whole thing of no effort, no reward.
Yes, I suppose that's true.
But I mean, I actually really hope that some people listen to this who are struggling with ADHD and autism, thinking I couldn't possibly be a CTO because here's Meri Williams going, well, this is where I am, this is what I've done. I think it's amazing. So I just want to go back to the sort of the tech side of things a little bit, if we could. So I think you said, again, might have been the same interview or another one, because I've listened to a few, you said that you were moving to more of an API first way of working.
Yeah.
And I just thought it'd be interesting to talk about what are the challenges, do you think, when an API becomes more of a product as opposed to a UI or an app or something like that? What are the big differences from a tech perspective?
So it's been really fascinating, that journey of becoming much more API first. And a lot of it is exactly as you say, you have to think of the API as a product as well. You have to think about versioning, and you have to think about backwards compatibility, and you need to try and make sure that you put something out into the world that you're not going to be making breaking changes to every 5 minutes, because it becomes impossible for other people to build on top of you. But when I joined Pleo, there was just a huge desire for autonomy in teams, but then almost no way for them to build on top of each other's work in a sensible way. So anytime you wanted to build on top of somebody else's part of the product, you had to go and almost embed yourself in their team in order to deeply understand how it all worked, to be able to call deep into the stack in order to use it. And so we've done a pretty major transformation, and we did a partnership with a company called Skillawale, who do really fantastic, very contextual coaching. So they do coaching in small groups, just an hour a week, but they've done a whole curriculum with us to train people in good API design, in thinking about the security and the versioning, and thinking of the API as a product and all of that kind of stuff, to help it be so that these teams can build on top of each other's work without having to go and be fully embedded with each other in order to get stuff done. And so we found that that's made the teams much more autonomous, but it's also sped up development immensely because they can rely on each other's APIs. And we're now at a point where we're externalizing a lot of those. So we've got third parties who are building on top of us, because obviously we need to integrate with a lot of different accounting systems and HRIS systems and all of that kind of stuff in order for people to connect up their, who are their new joiners this month that need to get a Pleo card? How do the expenses get out at the end of the month and into their finance system? And there's a lot of finance systems in the world, and we don't necessarily have the capacity to build an integration for every single one. And so it's become very important for us to be able to use third parties to build those for each different market that we're in. One of the things I've learned since becoming CTO at Pleo is how diverse the finance systems are in Europe, in particular. Every country has a different front runner, a different kind of set of choices, and so then externalizing those APIs has meant that we can really scale our ability to integrate by using third parties and contractors and similar to build on top of ourselves.
I think it's really important, because I think a lot of engineers don't treat APIs as products. And what I mean is they don't think about another engineer in another room, in another country, in another company, taking it and implementing it. And I have a big problem because so often you see really poor error handling. You have no idea what's going on. In fact, I wrote a blog about it a few years ago. I just looked it up. It was 4 years ago, about API gateway at AWS. AWS, if you're listening, your error handling's terrible. And I don't know how to fix this. Other than I did at one company, we had another team build a sample product that went in the SDK. And once they tried to do it, of course, they're yelling at the back-end engineers like, how we don't know what this is doing. And so it really made them improve the documentation and the error handling. But I think that's an area that we do quite poorly sometimes in tech.
Yeah, so one of the things we've done is we have an architecture board internally, which consists of most of our staff engineers and our principal engineers and similar. And they've defined an API standard and a set of good design principles for APIs. And then every time we design a new API, we hold it up against that standard and those design principles and say, well, let's walk through some examples. Let's walk through some things that people will build on top of this. And are you paginating right? Are you thinking about the endpoints in the right way? Are you designing this so that it will be used, not so that you're just technically making your stuff accessible, but not making it truly usable. And then we've developed a whole set of rituals around that to make sure that we do really, really high quality APIs as we do them. I'm sure that when they're out in the world, we will still find stuff wrong, and we accept that. And we just say, what we'll do for the initial builds is that we'll have really strong relationships with these third parties that are building on top of us, and they're often working for us, right? We're employing them to build these things for us. We're not quite at the point where we've got people independently building lots of stuff in our marketplace, but we'll get there one day. But for now, we have a really tight feedback loop with them, and so we get lots of feedback and opportunity to improve things as we go. And we've taken an approach of kind of having a alpha beta general release, general availability, etc. Kind of approach as well, so that teams don't have to get it perfect first time. They've got some opportunity to develop as they go.
And last question, and I hope you don't mind me asking, but you talked about this in a very recent blog, or I think you found out you were diagnosed with, and I might be saying this wrong, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Is that how you say it?
Yes, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome.
Ehlers-Danlos syndrome.
Yeah.
And you said after you dislocated your shoulder twice, and this kind of resonated with me because I'm actually should be having shoulder surgery at some point. But I was thinking about how society treats disabled people. And in tech, we talk about diversity in tech, right, and all of these things. And I was thinking, I don't think I've ever interviewed someone in a wheelchair at any job I've ever been at. And how do we get more people with physical disabilities into tech? Because I almost think that's the last invisible one, almost, right? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and it's interesting because actually tech attracts people who can't stand all day or
that's true.
lift heavy things and that kind of stuff, right? So there's actually quite a lot of people in tech who've got quite often invisible illnesses. So Ehlers-Danlos, all my joints dislocate, but unless you see me first thing in the morning when I'm popping my fingers back into joint and my shoulder back into place and my knee back into place, you wouldn't necessarily know, right? But one of the things I talk about when I give talks on diversity and inclusion is I've never interviewed anywhere where if I were having a bad day and I was on crutches or in a wheelchair that day, which does happen sometimes, I've never interviewed anywhere where I knew in advance whether I'd be able to get to the room, because it's not the kind of information that anybody puts on the website. It's not the kind of information anybody includes in their interviewer pack for their interviewees. It became a running joke when I was interviewing with Monzo that I taught every interviewer I had how to get their card updated so they could use the elevator, because they just all went up this long flight of stairs, and I just looked at it and went, the chances my knee dislocates are not small enough that I want to risk it just before an interview. And so I made friends with the security guard, figured out how the system worked, and got everybody to update their cards so that they could use the elevator to take me up to the office. And it literally became a running joke. And it was sort of funny, but it was also kind of not, because if I turned up in a wheelchair one day, nobody would have had any idea how to get me up into the office. And it's super common that we think about lots of different types of diversity, but we don't think about neurodiversity or physical disability anywhere near enough. And I think it's a real shame, because on the face of it, we should be one of the best careers for folks who've got those kind of limitations, because we're fundamentally keyboard warriors, right? As long as the whiteboard adjusts down as well so you can reach it, you should be able to be in tech and be in a wheelchair or be on crutches, and it hardly matter at all, because we do all of our collaboration virtually. Many of us are remote first, and so you can sit at home and not have to worry about commutes and whether those are accessible and that kind of stuff. And so I'd really love to see us become better at providing really well for folks with disabilities in tech.
Definitely agree.
Well, Meri, on those words, thank you very much for joining today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been great to talk to you again.
Thank you. And for everybody listening, we'll be back in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.